We're at this kind of perhaps inflection point in our politics. The old parties falling apart, new parties emerging, perhaps even the prevailing system falling apart or the prevailing progressive ideology. So I wanted to ask you, what moment in history does this most resemble, and what can we learn from historical precedent?
I think it resembles a moment that I've already in effect referred to. We are rerunning the 1970s at high speed. That means, I think, that we're going to see a major financial crash. I would have thought it's less than 12 months away. In other words, the 76, when the IMF was brought in. Remember, a friend of mine, Mark Littlewood, with whom I'm doing an awful lot of this political analysis through PopCon, has done a very interesting comparative calculation. Back in 76, when there was the reference because of Healy behaving in exactly the same way that Rachel Reeves has done, letting expenditure rip and letting taxation rip even more. Healy found himself having to summon in the IMF. Do you know what percentage of the IMF's available reserves were taken up by rescuing Britain in 1976?
Economics is my weak point, so I have no idea.
Right, it's 10%.
Okay.
Entirely manageable. Mark has done a calculation looking at the relative indebtedness now and the relative indebtedness then. Now our debt is almost 100% of GDP. Almost 100%. Then it was between 30 and 40%.
We're paying something like 100 billion a year in tax alone. Servicing the debt alone.
Interest rate payments now are consuming 100 billion a year. Last month, to put it into perspective, we borrowed 20 billion pounds. There was a shortfall of income and expenditure. Do you know what percentage? Right. Okay, we borrowed 20 billion. How much do we spend on paying interest of the 20 billion?
Well, I've heard we spend about 100 billion a year.
No.
On the 20 billion
No,
alone.
in 1 month, come on, you're failing your exam.
Exactly. I told you I would.
In 1 month, we borrowed 20 billion.
Right.
How much of that 20 billion are we spending on interest?
Don't know.
16.
Wow.
In other words, we're doing what a company or an individual going broke does.
Yes.
You know, if you look at your credit card and you can't pay that monthly amount, what do? You borrow a bit more, and most of it goes on interest. We're in exactly the same position. And what Mark calculated is that now, if we were to do an equivalent rescue to 1976, it would require 50%. 5 times as much of the cash reserves of the IMF, the credit reserves, which is completely inconceivable that you would punt that much onto one country. Anyway, going back, so we're rerunning the 70s. We're already seeing, on the one hand, the risk of major financial collapse. We are seeing again with the NHS, the nurses have already now announced they're going to go on strike. So the doctors are on strike, the nurses will go on strike, which will lead exactly to the winter of discontent. Indeed, we have a mini winter of discontent in Birmingham where the bins are unemptied. So we're seeing all those side phenomena. The thing that I think is central, however, is a very, very parallel political crisis. And it begins essentially as a crisis of conservatism. Now, I'm so old. I was a young man at this point. I just got my first job. I'd gone from Cambridge to the London School of Economics in the October of 1972. I just got myself into the London housing market. 3 guesses how much property prices had increased by between January 1972 and January 1973. We were talking about your equivalent flat. A little new build flat. You were in the North London. I was in an unfashionable bit of South London on the top of Sydenham Hill in Forest Hill. How much had that flat increased in value because of government policy in 1 year from January 72 to January 73?
I think I know it. I think it went from 3,000 to 10,000.
3 times in 1 year. That was the mismanagement of a conservative government. We had exactly the equivalent of Liz Truss. It was Anthony Barber and the Barber boom, and there was exactly the same consequence. Edward Heath lost, much less catastrophically than Rishi Sunak, but he lost twice to Harold Wilson to Labour. And at which point there was exactly the sort of debate that's going on now in the Conservative Party. But of course, there wasn't a reform. And the debate in the Conservative Party centred around two figures. It was going to centre around Margaret Thatcher as the new leader. Remember, we're celebrating the anniversaries of all of this. It's exactly 50 years since Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. And the key figure, though, the intellectual, the man who analysed it, the man who answered that question that you asked me back in the 1970s, Sir Keith Joseph. And the answer that Keith Joseph comes up with is the answer that I think answers your question today. Right. What he said was, I've called myself a conservative, but I haven't been one. I've been a cabinet member of a Conservative government that's done nothing conservative. So what's gone wrong is exactly the same as what went wrong from 1951 to the 1970s. From 1997 to 2010, you had the regime of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. You had what, in retrospect, is the most constitutionally radical government in British history since Oliver Cromwell. Right? We've had a concealed, slow burn revolution.